The Ledger of Empire, Great Britain, and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Introduction. The myth of the periphery. We often tell ourselves a very specific story about Britain and slavery. It is a comforting story. It is a story of redemption. It is a narrative dominated by the moral crusade of William Wilberforce, the parliamentary thunder of the abolitionists, and the ultimate triumph of the 1807 and 1833 Acts. We look at the ending, and we congratulate ourselves on the exit. However, I am not here to talk about the exit. I am here to talk about the building. If we look past the self-congratulatory focus on abolitionism, a forensic examination of this country's economic, political, and social fabric reveals a darker, foundational reality. The slave trade was not a peripheral activity conducted by a few rogue merchants in Bristol or Liverpool. It was not a side hustle of the British economy. The transatlantic slave trade was the nuclear reactor of British imperial capitalism. From the state-sponsored monopolies of the Stuart monarchs to the free trade explosion of the Georgian era, the commodification of African humanity was woven into the credit structures of the City of London, the industrial output of the Midlands, and the civic architecture of our great port cities. Over the next 16 minutes, we are going to open the Ledger of Empire. We will move beyond the standard timeline to explore the slave plantation complex as the engine of the Industrial Revolution. We will examine the West India interest, the lobby that delayed freedom for decades. We will give due credit to the agency of the enslaved, whose rebellions in Demerara and Jamaica rendered the system unsustainable. And finally, we will look at the receipt. We will interrogate the financial legacy of the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act, revealing how the British taxpayer, you and I, serviced the debt for compensating slave owners until the year 2015. This is not a story of the past. It is an accounting of the present. Part 1. The Corporate State, 1660 to 1750. Let us begin at the genesis. We often imagine the slave trade as a chaotic free-for-all, but its roots in Britain were bureaucratic, royal, and state-sanctioned. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 didn't just bring back the king, it brought back a formalized apparatus for human trafficking. In 1660, King Charles II granted a charter to what would become the Royal African Company, RAC. This was not a private startup. This was an extension of the Crown's geopolitical ambition. Its investors included members of the royal family, including the future King James II. The RAC was granted a monopoly, a total lock, on English trade in West Africa. This privilege encompassed gold, ivory, silver, and most lucratively, human beings. During this monopoly, the RAC built a fortified infrastructure along the West African coast, anchored at Cape Coast Castle in modern-day Ghana. If you look at the digital history projects mapping the correspondence of this era, you see the cold bureaucracy of evil. Over 3,000 surviving letters from 1681 to 1699 detail the minutiae. Requests for guns and brass to buy captives, reports on the health of the stock, geopolitical maneuvering against the Dutch. The Royal African Company shipped more African slaves to the Americas than any other single corporate entity in the history of the Atlantic trade. Between 1672 and 1731, they launched 653 voyages, transporting 187,697 people. The brutality of logistics is found in the mortality rates. Of those embarked, 38,497 died during the Middle Passage. That is a 20% loss rate, 1 in 5. But monopolies breed resentment. The independent merchants of Bristol and Liverpool, the interlopers, demanded a piece of the action. They argued that the RAC was choking the supply of labour to the colonies. In 1698, Parliament deregulated the trade. This was the moment the floodgates opened. The British slave trade shifted from a royal enterprise to a national industry. The volume of human traffic exploded. The RAC couldn't compete with the efficiency of the private traders and eventually dissolved, but the damage was done. The infrastructure was laid. Part 2. The rise of the provincial ports. This deregulation brings us to the cities we know today. The shift to free trade in humans catalyzed the ascent of provincial ports that soon eclipsed London. Let's look at the numbers. Between 1695 and 1807, London launched 3,100 voyages, Bristol launched 2,200, Liverpool launched 5,300. Liverpool became the global capital of the slave trade. Its civic identity was, and historically remains, tied to this economy. The town hall, designed in 1749, features friezes of African faces, elephants and crocodiles, symbols of the trade that paid for the stones. Between 1787 and 1807, every single mayor of Liverpool was involved in the trade. In Bristol, the trade was dominated by the Society of Merchant Venturers. This wasn't a fringe group, these were the city fathers. A quarter of its members were traffickers. Men like Edward Colston and Michael Becker laundered the proceeds of slavery into philanthropic projects, schools, almshouses, concert halls. They embedded the blood money into the very social infrastructure of the city. But why does this matter economically? This brings us to the Williams thesis. In 1944, Eric Williams, who would later become the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, published Capitalism and Slavery. He argued that profits from this trade provided the essential capital that financed Britain's Industrial Revolution. For years, historians tried to debunk this. They said the profits were too small, only 0.5% of GDP. But they were looking at the wrong numbers. They were looking only at the shipping profits. When you look at the slave plantation complex, the whole ecosystem, the picture changes. The gun manufacturers in the Midlands making weapons to sell in Africa, the textile mills making cloth for slave clothing, the shipbuilders, the sugar refiners. By 1800, the value added by industries directly related to the plantation complex had risen to 10.8% of British GDP. It was a multiplier effect. Britain produced goods to buy captives. The captives produced raw materials for Britain. The colonies served as a captive market for finished British goods. This cycle created the demand shock that incentivized industrialization. The capital accumulated in Liverpool didn't sit under a mattress. It built canals. It built railways. It funded the steam engine. Part 3. The Mathematics of Murder and Finance. This system required money. It required credit. It required insurance. The British banking system evolved to meet this need. The Bank of England was not immune. In the 1770s, the Bank of England actually came into direct ownership of 2 plantations in Grenada and 599 enslaved people. Why? Because a borrower defaulted on a mortgage. The bank treated these human beings exactly as they were legally defined, fungible financial assets on a balance sheet. We see the DNA of this era in our high street banks. Predecessors of Barclays, Lloyds Banking Group and HSBC all have links to the financing of the trade or the compensation of slave owners. But nowhere is the commodification of humanity more chilling than in the insurance sector. Lloyds of London became the global centre for underwriting the risk of the Middle Passage. This leads us to the darkest case study in British legal history, the Zong Massacre. In 1781, the ship Zong, owned by a Liverpool syndicate, was sailing with 442 enslaved people, double its safe capacity. The captain, Luke Collingwood, made a cold calculation. If the captives died of thirst or disease, the loss fell on the owners. But if they were jettisoned to save the ship from a navigational emergency, it could be claimed as a general average loss under insurance. Over several days, the crew threw 132 men, women and children overboard to their deaths. When they returned to England, this was not a murder trial. It was a civil suit, Gregson versus Gilbert. The owners wanted their insurance money. The Solicitor General, John Lee, stood in a British court and argued that this case was practically identical to, and I quote, "if horses had been killed or wood thrown overboard." Lord Mansfield, the Lord Chief Justice, famously ruled for a retrial, but strictly on the grounds of insurance fraud regarding the water supply. The fundamental premise that human beings could be insured and murdered for a payout was not legally challenged. This is the ledger of empire in its most literal, brutal form. Part 4. The Political Fortress and the Resistance. While the financiers managed the money, the West India interest managed the politics. This was a formidable block of absentee planters and merchants who sat in the House of Commons. They were well funded. In 1789, they set up a fighting fund, taxing merchants to pay for pro-slavery lobbying. They were the reason abolition was delayed for so long. We often hear about the gradual abolition proposed in 1792 by Henry Dundas. History sometimes paints this as pragmatic. In reality, it was a delaying tactic that bought the trade another 15 years of life. So, what actually broke the system? It wasn't just speeches in Westminster, it was fire in the Caribbean. We must correct the record and give credit to the agency of the enslaved. The fear of a Haitian-style revolution is what truly forced the British hand. Consider the Demerara Rebellion of 1823 in modern-day Guyana. 12,000 people rose up, led by Jack Gladstone and his father Kwamina. It was triggered by rumors that the king had granted free papers that the planters were withholding. The British response was genocidal. Over 200 were killed. Heads were displayed on poles. But the death of a white missionary, John Smith, in custody, turned British public opinion against the planters. Then came the decisive blow, the Baptist War, or Christmas Rebellion, in Jamaica, 1831. This was the largest uprising in the British West Indies, involving 60,000 people, orchestrated by Samuel Sharp, an enslaved Baptist deacon. Sharp used the Bible to radicalize his followers, preaching that no man can serve two masters. The planters suppressed it with savagery, executing over 300 people, including Sharp. But when missionaries returned to Britain and testified about the brutality, the political consensus shifted. Parliament realized that if they did not abolish slavery from above, the enslaved would destroy the system from below. Part 5. The Economics of Emancipation, 1833. This brings us to the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. We are taught to view this as a moment of moral victory, but financially it was a massive bailout. To get the West India interest to agree, the government agreed to pay £20 million in compensation. Let's contextualize that number. It was 40% of the government's total annual expenditure in 1833. It was roughly 5% of British GDP. Not a single penny went to the enslaved. It all went to the owners for the loss of their property. To fund this, the government took out a £15 million loan, brokered by Nathan Meyer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore. It was one of the largest private bailouts in history, and here is the fact that should stop us in our tracks. In 2018, HM Treasury tweeted a Friday fact. They revealed that the debt incurred to pay this compensation was not fully repaid until 2015. Think about what that means. It means that for 182 years, British taxpayers, including the descendants of the enslaved who arrived in the Windrush generation, were paying taxes to service the debt used to compensate the men who enslaved their ancestors. Who got the money? The Legacies of British Slave Ownership project at UCL has shown us. It wasn't just aristocrats. 40% of claimants were women, widows and spinsters using human property as a pension fund. John Gladstone, father of the future Prime Minister, received £105,781, the modern equivalent of £100 million, for the 2,508 people he owned. The ancestors of current politicians and business leaders appear on these ledgers. This wealth didn't vanish. It was reinvested. It built country houses. It funded railways. It capitalized new businesses. Part 6. The False Dawn and Economic Reality. Even after 1833, freedom was not free. The Act instituted apprenticeship. Formerly enslaved people were compelled to work 40 to 45 hours a week without pay for their former masters. It was slavery by another name. Since masters couldn't whip workers arbitrarily anymore, the state stepped in with special magistrates and the treadmill. We have the narrative of James Williams, an 18-year-old apprentice in Jamaica, who described women being tied to the treadmill and flogged as if they were flogging a cow if they couldn't keep up. It took another wave of resistance and exposure by activists to finally end apprenticeship on August 1st, 1838. But the final economic twist came in 1846. With the Sugar Duties Act, Parliament prioritized free trade over protectionism. They equalized tariffs, forcing Jamaican sugar to compete with slave-grown sugar from Cuba and Brazil. The Caribbean economy collapsed. The planters, having taken their compensation, abandoned the islands to poverty. To replace the labor, they imported hundreds of thousands of indentured workers from India and China. The demographic landscape of Trinidad and Guyana today is a direct result of this desperate scramble for cheap labor after slavery. Conclusion: the ledger remains open. Slow the pace. Adopt a concluding, reflective tone. So, where does this leave us? The British slave trade ended over 2 centuries ago, but its legacies are not dead. They are active. They are active in the architecture of Liverpool and Bristol. They are active in the family fortunes of the British elite. They are active in the persistent underdevelopment of the Caribbean, a region that CARICOM argues is owed reparatory justice for the wealth that was extracted and never returned. And they are active in our national accounting. We must recognize that Great Britain's rise to global power was not a miracle of pluck and ingenuity alone. It was an engine fueled by the slave plantation complex. The Royal African Company laid the infrastructure. The free market exploded the volume. The City of London insured the risk. The Industrial Revolution was fed by the raw materials. The end of slavery was not a simple gift from Westminster. It was a concession forced by Samuel Sharp, Jack Gladstone, and thousands of unnamed rebels. The financial ghost of slavery, in the form of that 1835 loan, haunted the British Treasury until 2015. To speak of British history without placing this ledger at its centre is to speak of a fiction. We have looked at the credit column of our history for too long. It is time we fully understood the debit. Thank you.